Hi, good morning, and thanks for braving the weather to join us this morning. It is the 1-month anniversary of Governor introducing his all-tax budget, and we wanted to acknowledge the passage of that time. We have a cake from his closest supporters and the comments that we've heard from them over the last month. We have some cupcakes for the members of the press when we're all done, and we just wanted to remind you a little bit. This is Minnesota's economy on Republican policies. It's glowing and growing. Governor Dayton's tax bill, that's what we can expect from what we're hearing from the business community. And we have been having some fun here, poking a little bit about it being a festive occasion, but this is serious business. We hear over and over again businesses are concerned about business-to-business taxes. We have a highly regressive sales tax, haircuts, car repairs, things families need every day. Governor Dayton doesn't appear to be getting the message because this week his full tax plan was voted closer to passage by Democrats in both bodies. Not a single Republican supported that bill. It's time for us to get refocused on helping Minnesota businesses grow, and I don't think Governor Dayton gets that yet. So we need to keep sending that message, and we will. It's also been gun week in the Senate. And in the Senate, we took a vote along party lines to support the Second Amendment, and that's where we stand. We thank the people who've been coming down to the Capitol to make their voice heard on this critical issue. It's not time for us to be changing Minnesota's gun laws. It's time for us to focus on growing our economy.
Well, good morning. And in the House of Representatives in the last week, two major events happened. One is we took a look at the governor's tax bill, and the other is we looked at the governor's education bill. And as Senator Benson said, today is the 1-month anniversary of the governor's tax proposal and his budget proposal. And after a month of public vetting, I think it's apparent that DFL legislators really are the only people left in the state of Minnesota who actually support the plan. It includes a $3.7 billion tax increase, a $2.1 billion sales tax increase on the goods and services that all Minnesotans use on a daily basis. And what has been called by the governor as a balanced approach actually really increases spending by $22 for every dollar in cuts that he proposes. And it continues to delay the payments to our schools that will result in an additional $151 million owed to them at the completion of his budget cycle. The governor's tax plan not only increases taxes and the tax burden on all Minnesotans, but we got to remember that it also increases the burden on our cities and counties and our local governments by taxing the services they use as well. And I think it's pretty easy for Minnesotans to understand that also equates to increased property taxes. The pressure for property tax increases by local governments certainly will be much stronger as a result of these sales tax payments that will have to make back to the state. And at a time when Midwestern states and really states across the nation are cutting taxes and encouraging economic growth, the governor decided to double down on an already overburdened Minnesota taxpayer. And we also heard the governor's education budget in committee this week in the House Education Finance Committee. And the governor's education budget isn't bold, as was promised. It isn't beautiful. And in fact, it's bland and it's boring. At a time when school districts are facing decreasing revenues from the feds as a result of sequestration and increasing costs from compliance with the Affordable Care Act, this budget puts marginal dollars into the same old education programs that lead us to the same old results. This budget, the education budget, prioritizes the Minnesota Department of Education at the expense of prioritizing dollars where we know they make the most impact, and that's in the classroom. It's not exactly the kind of budget that addresses our worst in the nation achievement gap or helps those kids who are trapped in an education system where students of color in 4th and 8th grade are more than 2 grade levels behind their white counterparts in reading proficiency. Now, if the governor had actually taken the bipartisan approach here and capitalized on the bipartisan support for paying back the school shift, he really would have set a stage for the rest of the session. But he decided not to do that in his education budget. He ignores the budget shift or the payment shift to our schools until 2017. And most importantly, even beyond that, is that the governor's plan does very little to address the lack of opportunities that have historically led to the upward mobility enjoyed by previous generations of Minnesotans as a result of our K-12 education system. Now, I will give the governor some credit on this one. He gave a little bit of leadership within that education budget, because he did call for an additional $44 million for the Opportunity Scholarships, also known as vouchers, for early learning and for preschool families, to empower them to make the choices that are best for their families. And it's a pilot project that we put together in the last budget, and we're glad to hear the governor is taking that seriously and is moving forward with those Opportunity Scholarships for those Minnesotan preschoolers who need it the most. So with that, we're open to any questions you might have. Okay, thank you very much.
Senator Benson, I have a question about, you mentioned guns in relation to the budget. Why are you mentioning that? The budget is moving forward and guns are moving along in a parallel track, but do you think one is overshadowing the other?
Well,
or they're spending more time on it?
The governor's budget was late, which is why it had to go through Rules Committee. The bills were late. So with all the administrative power that he has, he didn't get it to us on time. And so with deadlines and commitments to make, we need to be focused on, are his policies good policies? I don't think so. And are we going to get this done on time? So it's fine that they're having the gun debate, but I don't think it's the highest priority for most Minnesotans. It's reaction to public events.
Along those lines, for anybody, the governor's budget is, he says that you shouldn't take out any one thing. You should consider it as a whole. Do I understand that Republicans are not going to offer an alternative budget? So you're in the position where you're able to criticize it, but not offer an alternative.
Well, and we did offer a budget 2 years ago based on our principles, working in a bipartisan way with the governor in order to get it done. And so we will continue to bring up those principles. And as the governor's budget is brought forward in committee, we'll be very clear about where we agree. There will be small places where we agree, as Representative Woodward spoke. But we're going to be very clear where we disagree as well. Minnesotans need to understand what their choices are when it comes to how their government is run and how their taxes are spent.
Should we look at your budget from 2 years ago as a guide to where you would be going with this?
I think it's a start, but being in a divided government, we started out trying to stand for our principles, but also understand that the governor was going to have different positions. So it's not going to be the totality of our views, but it's a good indication.
If I might just add to that, Senator Benson. Absolutely. So I would agree with what Senator Benson had to say there, but I would add one particular point, and that is that it's clear the DFL runs the joint, and it is really this is their budget, and we will be taking a critical look at it, and that's our job, so that we know that because they have all power here in the legislature at the moment, that they don't get away with things that we think are bad for Minnesota. And certainly the tax proposal that the governor has is bad for all Minnesotans and really does increase the tax burden, not just on the upper 2% as he promised, but on all Minnesotans.
So once again, elections have consequences.
Elections certainly do have consequences, but it doesn't mean that we don't have a role to play, and we will be looking at each piece of the budget, providing impact, describing the impact that budget will have on Minnesotans, as well as providing opportunities for us to look at it a different way and innovative ideas that makes that budget better.
Representative, on the education bill, the governor's
Yes, sir.
education bill, what would you do differently besides you would support the early ed funding, you would want to pay back the shift, but you don't want to raise taxes? So what would your education budget look like? You'd have to cut, wouldn't you? I mean, you wouldn't really have any new money.
Well, I think it's a question of priorities. So I think when Senator Benson talked about our last budget did show our priorities within education. We put $100 onto the general ed formula. The governor puts 52 on, and then increases spending for the Minnesota Department of Education for things like school climate centers and regional centers of excellence. We think that's the wrong approach. That really what we need to do is put money in the classroom. It's not about how much money is being spent, it's where it's being spent and how it's being spent. So I think that's a good role model to look at, is what we presented in the last budget.
Representative, looking at the governor's budget plans for education as it stands now, where will you advocate to shift things to talk about the spending priorities that you just talked about?
Well, I think, again, if you look at House File 1, the number one priority of the DFL was to pay back the shift. And if you go back to all the lit pieces you'll see in both DFL and Republican candidates, they said we got to stop doing that. We have to stop the accounting gimmicks. We have to pay for our past obligations before we make empty promises for the future. And I think that if you go back, you'll see that there's bipartisan support for paying that back. We've got House File 134 that pays back the entire shift. Their House File 1 pays back $550 million. There's all kinds of ways in which we can prioritize the budget, including looking at our cash reserves, looking at again, paying back those obligations as opposed to making those empty promises. If you look at what he's doing with kindergarten, he actually has disincentives in that budget for people to go to full-day kindergarten because of his changes in the per-pupil weighting and the way he is going to fund what he calls all-day kindergarten. And we heard testimony on that this week. So that's an empty promise. You know, it sounds good to say we're going to pay for all-day kindergarten, but when you look under the hood, there's not a big engine underneath it.
Do you support all-day kindergarten free for any parent or district that wants it, like the governor says he wants?
Yeah. Well, I think it depends upon the specific situation. Kindergarten is good for many Minnesota kids. It's not good for all of them. Some Minnesota kids do better in other environments rather than the traditional kindergarten system. What I would fully support is expanding the governor's Opportunity Scholarship Program to kindergarten as well.
Just, looking at the big picture just a little bit, I think if you moved to Minnesota 6 or 7 weeks ago when this session started and you read the paper, you'd conclude that what the Democrats are talking about is grabbing guns, gay marriage, and growing government. And what I would challenge each Minnesotan to do is ask yourself, how is that going to help you? If you're a man or woman driving to work today trying to figure out how to make ends meet and now you pay more taxes, assuming that the governor's proposal becomes law, you're going to pay more taxes on the day-to-day things that a family must do in order to operate, take care of their children. Is that good for you? When you look at people in this state who are law-abiding citizens and sportsmen and women that like to hunt, like to shoot, like to do these things, and the DFL is looking at restrictions to try to make your access more difficult or limit your access, how does that help your family? How does it help your family? I think the bottom line is, yes, elections do have consequences. And what we've learned is what the DFL priorities are. And it seems to be grabbing guns, gay marriage, and growing the government. And I don't think there's a value proposition for people in that. And what I mean is, as Representative Woodard so accurately pointed out, you look at these budgets, and it's the same stuff. Growing government. I was born the year John Kennedy gave his inaugural address, sounded like Ronald Reagan, talking about supply-side economics, and by the late 60s we have President Lyndon Johnson growing government and creating a great society, which has not worked. It hasn't alleviated the poverty problems. The government programs continue to grow. We continue to spend more money on them, and it doesn't help the typical American family or the typical family in Minnesota. Why would we go back to that? That would be my question.
Well, wouldn't you, by that theory, we wouldn't have a military because it hasn't ended wars?
Well,
I mean, we have the biggest military in the world, which we all fully support, and yet we were attacked on September 11th. I mean, just because we haven't ended a problem doesn't mean we don't spend money on it, doesn't it?
I would argue that the military has done a pretty good job of, by and large, keeping America free and protecting our citizens. Is anything perfect? No. Okay. But I don't know that the objective of military is to end wars. The objective of military is to win wars. How we got in a foreign policy debate, I'm not sure, but so I love you.
You were the one who said we shouldn't have poverty programs, so.
I didn't say that, Jim. I said we continue to pour more and more money
haven't ended poverty
into them, and it hasn't been successful.
Okay.
Not only have we not ended it, but the very people who advocate for these things say we just need more of the same. It hasn't worked because we haven't done enough of it. And that's what we're getting out of this governor.